Thank you. Good morning to you all and welcome to today's commemoration of the 10th anniversary of the Syrian Revolution. This session is being simultaneously interpreted, so please see the translation button at the bottom of your screen to select the language. Thank you in advance to the technical and translation teams for their support. My name is Rafif Jouejati and I'll be moderating today's discussion, which is co-sponsored by the National Coalition of Syrian Revolution and Opposition Forces and the governments of Estonia, France, Germany, Qatar, Turkey, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Syria has survived more than 50 years of brutal dictatorship and a decade of war waged primarily by the Assad regime and its allies against the people of Syria. This week marks a decade of atrocities that have included forced disappearances, starvation sieges, barrel bombs, and chemical weapons attacks. Nonetheless, the Syrian people have remained resilient. Despite nearly 12 million forcibly displaced Syrians, the threat of famine, and an untenable economic situations, Syrians continue to demand freedom, dignity, and democracy. Clearly, the need for a political settlement can no longer be ignored. Today, our goals are to highlight the Syrian people's resilience and to reaffirm Syrians' commitment to a democratic and free Syria through a sustainable political process. Today, we will hear from esteemed speakers, followed by remarks from our generous co-sponsors. We will then move into a question and answer period. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce our initial speakers, who will each have about 5 minutes to share their insights. Our speakers are, in order, Abdah, President of the Syrian Negotiation Commission, Rime Allaf, writer and political analyst and member of the Board of Directors of the Day After Association, Thuraya Hejazi, member of the General Secretariat of the Syrian Women's Political Movement, and Walaa Ahmado, activist and human rights defender living in Efrin, Syria. With that, Mr. Abdah, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rafif, and good morning and good afternoon, Your Excellencies, colleagues, friends, wherever you are. Let me start by saying that an uprising started by school children in Syria has evolved into a full revolution and survived for 10 years. Who would have thought that? Who would have given ordinary Syrian citizens any chance against a Russia and Iran-backed mafia state armed with chemical weapons and an air force? It was a revolution against the most callous dictator of modern times. 10 years, and the Syrian revolution is still alive and living still. The opposition was not meant to survive this long. And yet, here we are, bruised but steadfast, our heads raised high and still very much in the fight. It is a testament to the courage of millions of my countrymen and women that their most important act of defiance is simply continuing to exist on Syrian land. We may not have won the war, but we have not been eliminated either. The body that I lead, the Syrian Negotiation Commission, is tasked with negotiating an end to the war in line with the UN Resolution 2254. More than 5 years since it was unanimously adopted by the UN Security Council. Not even a single item in this resolution was implemented. Culpability lies squarely with the Assad, who rejects any idea of a negotiated agreement. His backers, Russia and Iran, bear a great deal of responsibility for his intransigence. This year, ladies and gentlemen, is a make or break for the UN Resolution 2254. We need a new mechanism to implement it. As for the Constitutional Committee, we in the SNC did everything possible to make it work and facilitate its success. The Syrian regime, on the other hand, used all the tricks in the book to make it fail. We supported and still very much support the UN Special Envoy, Geir Pedersen, in his efforts to implement the UN Resolution 2254 in its entirety. Ladies and gentlemen, millions of Syrians in the north depend on humanitarian aid for survival and to get their most basic needs. What is needed today is for the international community to do all that it has at its disposal to ensure the millions of people in that part of Syria are not left at the mercy of the regime that caused their hardships to begin with, by putting forth a serious effort to extend the cross-border humanitarian aid resolution around July this year, and to have in place a contingency plan that can quickly go into effect in case the moral obligation and responsibility towards the Syrian people is not enough to dissuade some Security Council members from voting against the continued supply of much needed humanitarian aid. Ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude by saying 2011 until now was the decade of the impossible revolution. Let not the coming decade be that of the impossible peace. Syria's children will never forgive us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Abdah. Very powerful words. Now let's go to Rime Allaf. You have the floor.
Thank you, Ms. Jouejati. Excellencies, esteemed peers, ladies and gentlemen. I was born in Syria. I spent the best part of my childhood in my beloved United States, and much of my adult life in the UK and in different corners of the European Union, of which I am a proud citizen. On regular visits to Syria, I would wish for its people what we take for granted in the US and in Europe: rule of law, freedom of speech, basic human dignity, and, to borrow from that most famous of preambles, certain unalienable rights such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Young people everywhere have dared to dream that their lives are just as valuable as those for whom those words were written. Words that the democratic world has preached for decades. Never again, we were told years ago, only to find ourselves in a never before situation. How? Never before has the world been able to observe in real time the destruction of a nation and the extermination of a people who dared to demand dignity and freedom. Never before has a civilian population been filmed under attack with barrel bombs, savage airstrikes, and chemical weapons by its own illegitimate authorities. Never before have starvation sieges and old-fashioned barbaric massacres been so well documented as they happened. Never before has torture on an industrial scale been so evidenced. Never before has the world's indifferent silence been so loud, save for perfunctory condemnations and erasable red lines. And never before have the mightiest superpowers the world has ever known shamelessly pretended to be impotent. Syria is not only the epicenter of the greatest crimes against humanity in modern history, but also the epicenter of our collective failure as a global community. So here we are today, again, marking another anniversary and repeating the same mantras year after year. The only updates are in the horrific numbers that have come to summarize the Assad regime's war on the Syrian people. In 10 years, the numbers of killed, wounded, maimed, displaced, tortured, detained, forcibly exiled continued to rise. Since we marked the last anniversary of the revolution, Bashar Assad celebrated his 20th year on the throne. and the Assad dynasty marked its 50th year of dominating, subjugating, and terrorizing the Syrian population. So would you care to wager on what else we will be mentioning in March 2022? Or should we rather cut to the chase and decide once and for all that this anniversary should be the last of its kind? It's complicated, some of you say. No, it's not. Despite every atrocity they have endured, Syrians are still raising their independence flag. As they continue to demand a life of dignity, they have never raised a white flag. So why are you all raising a giant white flag in surrender to undemocratic forces, even as they impact life in your own countries? This gluttonous, incompetent, barbaric regime is unreformable, proving repeatedly it will use all means at its disposal to maintain its violent hold on power. So yank away this blanket of legitimacy you are inexplicably giving to actors who prop up a genocidal maniac, boasting he will not negotiate, refusing to comply with even the most basic demands of Security Council Resolution 2254. They are desperate to come out of this entanglement, and the solution is with you, with all of us. They want reconstruction money. We want the right conditions to allow Syrians to turn the page. They want a nuclear deal. We want a cessation of armed interference from all their militias in the entire region. They want sanctions relief. We want to free all detainees, allow aid to reach all Syrians, and let them decide for themselves how to run their country. We want accountability for all so that we can have justice and peace. Syrians started their revolution 10 years ago. It's time for the international community to start its own as well. Fight this war, not the last ones, and fight it with logic, resolve, and unity, not with weapons. Make the solution a new precedent, not only so that surviving Syrians can go home and begin to rebuild their country and their lives, hand in hand with the millions of Syrians still held hostage in regime-controlled areas, but also so that no other evil force is ever led to believe again that it can wreak havoc and sow the seeds of radical despair anywhere on our planet. Here's hoping that your and our legacy will be the one which inspires your own people, and for which young, educated, healthy Syrians will one day thank you. The ball is in your court. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Ms. Allaf. That was extremely powerful. Now let's go to Ms. Thuraya Hejazi, please. You have the floor.
شكرا بداية. السيدات السادة الحضور، الأصدقاء الأعزاء، اسمحوا لي أن أقول لكم بجزيل الشكر على إتاحة هذه الفرصة بالرغم من التأثير السلبي الإيجابيات فمنها هذا اللقاء. وأنا كسورية في الذكرى العاشرة لانطلاق الثورة السورية لا يمكن إلى أن سوريا المصنفة كأسوأ دولة للعيش في العالم لا يزال نبنى الصراع الإقليمية والدولية ونفتقد لحل سياسي عادل لا يرغب أحد بدعمه. السادة الحضور، لطالما سوري المرأة حقوقها السياسية والقانونية تجديد فئات الشعب في ظل تغيير وانتهاك حقوق الإنسان، بل عمل على تشويه مكانة المرأة وتكريس جهلها ورسم صورة نمطية ضعيفة للمرأة السورية لتأكد حقها لانتزاع حقوقها على التعبير. شاركت المرأة السورية منذ انطلاقة الثورة، وكان على كافة المستويات، بدءا من التظاهر وصولا للعمل الإنساني والحقوقي والإعلامي. وتزامن هذا مع حضور سياسي بينما أخفي تواجدها في التأثير الرسمي للعمل العسكري. وبالرغم من كافة المآلات التاريخية، عملت المرأة على تجديد الثقافات والخبرات ضمن المنظمات المدنية والحركات السياسية بكل أشكال الإخفاء والإفشال، ومعبرة عن الاجتماعية والإنسانية تجاه بلدها، وإيمانا منه بأن الحل السياسي هو الحل المنقذ لا الحل العسكري، كما عملت ومنها الحركة السياسية النسوية السورية والتي اليوم والتي تشكلت لمستقبل سوريا الحقيقية في المفاوضات. السيدات السادة الحضور، في كل نزاع مسلح تدفع الفتيات أثمان مضاعفة نتيجة والذي يقابل الاقتصادية والتي تسبب مزيدا من الإقصاء الاجتماعي والسياسي، وقد يكون الثمن الأكبر بينها إقصائهن من المساهمة في تحقيق السلام وفق رؤية ثرaya خاصة أن النساء طاقات فاعلة في إحلال السلام بطبيعتها أساسية للأمن والأمان العملية السياسية ووكيل التغيير إلى الديمقراطية مواقع صنع القرار، إذ إن هذا القانون مرتبط ارتباطا بعملية التحرير الديمقراطي واحترام حقوق الإنسان والمفهوم الصحيح للمواطن المتساوية والكاملة. ولهذا لا تزال نعمل في مسار عملية السلام بدءا من طاولة المفاوضات تقل عن 30% السيدات السادة الحضور، كامرأة سورية اعتقالا ونزولا ممن سوريا على دور الضحية فرضته الأبوية العمل على استثمار طاقتنا وتكلفنا بنفسنا كامرات لإحداث التغيير الجذري والحقيقي عملية السلام المستدام التي نأمل أن يتم الدفع باتجاهها. لذا نطالب دائما أولا بذل كل جهد للدفع العملية الوصول إلى حل سياسي شامل ومستدام بمشاركة النساء وتحقيقهم على وبيان جنيف بالمساءلة والمحاسبة الضامن لحقوق النساء. دعوة الدولية إلى دعم وتمويل الحركات والتحالفات طويل الأثر المال البشري أن يفتح باتجاه إحداث إصلاحات وتطويرات في حقوق المرأة وأيضا مناهضة القائمة النوع الاجتماعي. السيدات والسادة، تتبع سياسة الإفقار الممنهج بتدمير البشرية والثقافية والتي لا سيما تلك الخارجة عن سيطرته، ويتتبع بالعقوبات الاقتصادية الجديدة التي لم تحمل في طياتها سوى سياسية لإخضاع النظام لم تتناسق مع لهيكل السورية ومؤسساتها تجاذبات الممولين الدوليين، كما لم تترافق مع خطة عمل لإيجاد حل سياسي للقضية السورية. فكان هذا لإدارة الأزمة وهذا الإيجاد هذا يجعلنا مطلب بالغ الأهمية الدولي تطوير العقوبات الاقتصادية إلى عقوبات ذكية الشعب السوري وخاصة المرأة السورية الحل دورا لتحقيق استقلالها نأمل أننا قد قمنا في عمل جاد وحقيقي لضمان تعزيز التحول في الأدوار السكندرية واستمرارنا في نشر العدالة الاجتماعية.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hejazi. I believe we may have had some audio troubles. I believe the technical team is working on that. As a reminder, you can click at the bottom of your screen for translation into the language you prefer. Let's now go to Ms. Walaa Ahmado for her thoughts before our co-sponsors make some remarks. Ms. Ahmado, you have the floor.
شكرا جزيلا. أولاً أود شكر كل السيدات والسادة الحضور، وأخص بالذكر رئيس الجلسة لإتاحة هذه الفرصة للتحدث نيابة عن كل السوريات والسوريين بالداخل. أنا كسيدة سورية أتحدث الآن من الشمال السوري، موطن الثوار السلميين ومعقل قوات المعارضة وفصائل الجيش الحر، وأيضاً موطن أكثر من 6 ملايين نازح من كل المدن السورية التي خرجت ضد نظام الظلم والاستبداد مطالبة بالتغيير والحرية، ليهجروا كرها إلى بقعة معزولة عن العالم وسط ظروف إنسانية سيئة. فقد استقطبت هذه المنطقة أعداد متزايدة من السكان بسبب العمليات العسكرية والقصف الذي طال مناطقهم الأصلية. ووفقا للبيانات الصادرة عن منظمة الأمم المتحدة، فإن أكثر من نصف السوريين قد أجبروا على ترك منازلهم، حيث تقدر الإحصائيات وجود 6.3 ملايين نازح، يمثل الأطفال مع نسبة 55% من سكان مراكز الإيواء ومخيمات النزوح الرسمية وغير الرسمية، فيما نسبة 85% من السكان غير قادرين على تلبية الاحتياجات من الحد الأدنى، الاحتياجات الأساسية والمعيشية بشكل شهري بدون مساعدة. وقد عزل المناطق الخارجة عن سيطرة النظام جملة من التعقيدات، أولها سعي هذه المجتمعات نفسها إلى إيجاد بدائل لشكل الدولة من خلال تركيز مفهوم الحكم الذاتي في حين سعت مجتمعات أخرى إلى تكريس الجماعات القبلية والعشائرية كبديل لمفهوم الدولة، والتي سيطرت فيها أعراف وتقاليد يشدد عليها النظام الأبوي الذكوري، ما تسبب بعدد من التعقيدات استهدفت النساء بالدرجة الأولى، واللاتي حملن أعباء إضافية من خلال استغلال الأدوار التقليدية للنساء، بالإضافة إلى الحرمان من الحقوق المدنية ومن المستحقات الاجتماعية كالتعليم والصحة، بسبب المركزية الإدارية وأيضاً عدم الاعتراف بجملة المعاملات القانونية في هذه المناطق مثل تسجيل المواليد، ما يعزز الهشاشة القانونية. أيضاً أثر على الأدوار الإنتاجية الحالية والمستقبلية للنساء بسبب القيود على الحركة، الحرمان من التعليم، محدودية فرص العمل، الزواج القسري التزويج القسري والزواج المبكر، لتزيد من هشاشتهن الاقتصادية، الأمر الذي يزيد من تقويض مكانتهن السياسية والاجتماعية. بالإضافة لذلك فقد ظهر واقع جديد بسبب حملات التهجير والنزوح القسري على كل المدن الثائرة ضد نظام الأسد. المخيمات التي تتركز في الشمال ليست الوحيدة، هناك آخرون كثر يقطنون في مراكز إيواء جماعية هي غالباً مباني بلدية أو مستودعات أو مدارس أو هياكل مملوكة للقطاع الخاص كالمشاريع السكنية غير المنتهية بناؤها. تعاني هذه المناطق من الاكتظاظ السكاني الشديد، تعاني أيضاً من مشاكل التكيف، فساكنو هذه المناطق من بيئات مختلفة ويجبرون على العيش مع عائلات غريبة، الأمر الذي يفقدهم حقهم الطبيعي في التمتع بالخصوصية. ويقيد حركة النساء أيضاً وجود المرافق المشتركة غالباً بنقاط بعيدة عن الخيام يشكل خطراً على الأطفال والنساء ويخلق مشاكل اجتماعية كثيرة. يضاف إلى ذلك مشكلة البطالة طويلة الأمد بسبب فقدان فرص العمل وجائحة كوفيد-19، ارتفاع أسعار المواد الغذائية، وقد أدى الوضع الاقتصادي الهش والانخفاض الكبير في قيمة الليرة السورية إلى ارتفاع عدد المعوزين. الكثير من السوريين الآن يبيعون أصولهم وماشيتهم ويأكلون كميات أقل حتى يتمكنوا من إطعام أطفالهم، كما أنهم يرسلون أطفالهم إلى العمل بدل من إرسالهم إلى المدارس. هذا بالإضافة إلى المخاطر الأمنية الناتجة عن هجمات هشة وخروقات متعددة تستهدف البنى التحتية، المدارس والمستشفيات وأماكن تجمع المدنيين كالأسواق مثلاً. كل هذه الصعوبات والمآسي جعلت أغلب العائلات السورية مضطرة للاعتماد على المساعدات الإنسانية، والتي قد لا تفي باحتياجات الناس وخصوصاً النساء والأطفال، أيضاً خصوصاً الاحتياجات الصحية للنساء، فهي تستهدف الفئات الأقل أو الأكثر ضعفاً، موفرين لهم المال، المدافع، الوقود، مواد العزل للخيام، الملابس الشتوية، الأدوية، فضلاً عن المواد غير الغذائية، خدمات الحماية والدعم النفسي والاجتماعي. السيدات والسادة، لقد أغلقت الحدود أمام السوريين الباحثين عن الأمان في الخارج، لكنها فتحت بالاتجاه المعاكس منذ العام 2014 لإيصال المساعدات الإنسانية، وكانت متنفساً للمحتاجين والمحاصرين الذين احتملوا تبعات النزاع. لذلك ندعو كل الجهود الدولية والإنسانية لمواصلة إرسال المساعدات عبر معابر الشمال السوري التي تعتبر معابر حيوية لملايين من النازحين السوريين، ونؤكد على أن أي محاولة لإيقاف هذه المساعدات عبر الحدود سيمثل ضربة قاسمة لملايين العائلات السورية التي تعتمد عليها للتزود بالغذاء والعلاج والسلع الأساسية. كناشطات ونشطاء ندعو كل الجهود الدولية للضغط على جميع الأطراف المتنازعة والمجتمع الدولي للقيام بالمزيد لحماية كل المدنيين في سوريا وفق القانون الدولي. لذا يتوجب على أطراف النزاع الأطراف الدولية السير بإجراءات بناء الثقة والتفاوض للوصول إلى حل سياسي مستدام، ودعم كل جهود والبرامج الرامية لوضع إجراءات حماية الضحايا وتقديم الدعم النفسي وإعادة التأهيل. كما نطالب جميع كيانات الأمم المتحدة، المجتمع الدولي، منظمات الإغاثة الإنسانية الدولية والمحلية بتعزيز الأبعاد الجنسانية في البرامج الإغاثية والطوارئ وإعادة التأهيل، والعمل على برامج بناء القدرات بصورة تراعي الاعتبارات الجنسانية. أيضاً تعزيز مشاركة المرأة في محافل صنع القرار بشأن صياغة حل سياسي وخطط إعادة الإعمار. نعم، يمكنكم المساعدة لإحداث فارق في حياة كل العائلات السورية، النازحين والمهاجرين قسرياً، النساء والأطفال، العاملين في المجال الإنساني والصحي والدفاع المدني، وكل المناضلات والمناضلين الموجودين في هذه المنطقة. أرجو أننا قد نقلنا نبض الشارع السوري في الشمال المحرر عن سيطرة النظام، وأننا قد عبرنا عن رغبتنا الجادة لمواصلة العمل والتنسيق والمساعدة للمحافظة على أرواح وسلامة 6 ملايين إنسان طامحين للحرية والكرامة. شكرا لكم.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ahmado. I believe we now have some remarks from our co-sponsors. So Ambassador Sven Jurgensen of Estonia, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Let me begin with extending my gratitude to the Syrian National Coalition for organizing this event in remembrance of peaceful protests which started in Syria 10 years ago. Many of those who took to the streets back then have lost their lives. Millions of others have been forced to leave their country. Today's briefers are not just activists and observers, but survivors. I thank you for your work, dedication, and sincere testimonies. These presentations were a microcosm of millions of personal tragedies that Syrians now scattered across the world have gone.
You have the floor.
Hello, sorry?
Please continue.
It has been a decade of hope and a decade of destruction. After more than 500,000 deaths, the situation still remains a living nightmare. War continues, while the pandemic creates new challenges to the Syrian people in overcrowded refugee and IDP camps. In this light, renewing the cross-border aid mechanism this summer is our utmost duty. Madam Chair, more than 100,000 people remain arbitrarily detained or missing in Syria. Estonia, together with the European Union, calls for the creation of an international mechanism to locate missing people or their remains. There must be accountability for the many war crimes and crimes against humanity, and an end to impunity in Syria. Investigative mechanisms, such as the IIIM of the General Assembly and the Commission of Inquiry of the Human Rights Council, play a central role in collecting evidence of these crimes. We continue to work towards accountability because without justice, there will not be any real peace in Syria. The conflict will not end until the Syrian regime stops using torture to suppress free speech and silence its citizens. Legitimate claims of the Syrian opposition must be taken into account when looking into the future of Syria. Estonia and other EU member states support free and fair elections in Syria in accordance with Security Council Resolution 2254 under supervision of the United Nations, with all Syrians, including members of the diaspora, eligible to participate. Anything else would be considered yet another farce. Until there is genuine political progress, sanctions against the Syrian regime will remain in place. Syrian people will be delivered justice. The horrors of the war will never be forgotten. Once again, my sincere gratitude to our speakers today. Your courage is remarkable. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. And now I believe Ambassador Nicolas de Rivière of France. Did you have some remarks? You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank the Syrian National Coalition for organizing this important event to commemorate the grim anniversary of the Syrian conflict. 10 years ago, tens of thousands of Syrians took peacefully to the streets to demand that their most fundamental rights be respected. The brutal, indiscriminate response from Bashar al-Assad's regime and his role in the ensuing conflict triggered one of the most serious criminal enterprises and humanitarian crises since the Second World War. Today, the war is far from being over. Responsibility for this tragedy lies with the Syrian regime and its external supporters. The figures bear witness to the scale of the tragedy. The Syrian regime has committed hideous crimes that have revived the worst moments in recent history. It has tortured, besieged, and bombarded its own population to ensure that its clan remain in power rather than concede the slightest opening. It has used chemical weapons against women and children. Those crimes have been thoroughly documented by the UN, including the Commission of Inquiry's last two reports. They may amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. The regime, as I said, has also broken the taboo of the use of chemical weapons, putting in danger the non-proliferation regime that the international community has built together over the past decades. This use of chemical weapons against its own people has also been documented on numerous occasions. This is absolutely unacceptable. France and its partners have made it clear that they will not tolerate it. We will remain fully mobilized to ensure that an appropriate response is provided in the appropriate fora. It is high time to implement a political solution based on Resolution 2254 to avoid another decade of conflict at the expense of the Syrian people. This is necessary to restore the stability of Syria and the regime, as well as to allow for the safe, voluntary, and dignified return of Syrian refugees to their homes. It is all the more urgent to register progress on the implementation of all aspects of Resolution 2254. This means achieving progress on detainees and missing persons as a matter of priority, working towards the establishment of a nationwide ceasefire, preparing the holding of free and transparent elections under the UN supervision and in which the diaspora will be able to participate. The Syrian regime needs to engage at last in good faith in the Geneva negotiations. I want to commend the constructive approach of the Syrian Negotiations Committee and reiterate France's full support to the Syrian opposition. Until a long-lasting solution to the conflict is found, France is determined to continue its active support to the Syrian people. It will reaffirm its commitment in the framework of the next conference on the future of Syria on 29 and 30 March 2021. In 2018, the French president allocated 50 million euro to an emergency program to finance humanitarian and stabilization projects. This aid was renewed in 2021 for the 4th consecutive year. The European Union and its member states remain the largest donor of humanitarian aid to all Syrians in need. We also strongly echo the Secretary General's call for more humanitarian access and consensus on this crucial matter in the Security Council. Cross-border is a vital lifeline for millions of Syrians. France will also continue to fight against impunity. We will continue to support the work of the International Commission of Inquiry and the international impartial and independent mechanism. Several investigations have also been started by the courts, including in France and Germany. The condemnation of a Syrian regime agent in Koblenz marks the first important step in our joint fights against impunity. France, with its partners, will continue its actions to bring about a political solution for a stable, sovereign Syria in the service of the Syrian people. We will be ready to assist in the reconstruction of Syria only when a comprehensive, genuine, and inclusive political transition is firmly underway. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Before we go on to Ambassador Walaa Ahmado of Qatar, I would like to ask the translators, in the event that there is Arabic, can you please not do simultaneous interpretation, but actually consecutive so that we can work with the audio. And my other request is that if we have participants who would like to ask questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A section in the interest of time. Ambassador Al-Thani of Qatar, I give you the floor.
Thank you, Rafif. And I would like to also add my thanks to the Syrian National Coalition for organizing this event. And I'm honored to be in the company of our partners and as well the brave Syrian panelists. This week, of course, marks the grim 10th anniversary of the Syrian Revolution. The world is being reminded of the decade-long violence and the unspeakable atrocities committed by the Syrian regime and the consequences in terms of the horrific human cost. A generation of children has only known conflict and violence. Those who have survived are facing continued abuses, and the country now ranks at the bottom of the poverty index. Given the disastrous humanitarian situation in Syria, Qatar has long been among the leading providers of humanitarian aid and assistance to the brotherly Syrian people. We have as well committed to our legal and moral responsibility to call out on war crimes and crimes against humanity. Ensuring accountability and addressing impunity is a moral obligation and a condition for reconciliation, sustainable peace, and preventing the recurrence of these crimes. The atrocities in Syria are the most documented of any conflict and include the worst use of chemical weapons in a country. That is why the state of Qatar, along with Liechtenstein in 2016, was instrumental in the establishment of the IIIM in Syria by a resolution of the General Assembly. It has become a model international mechanism against impunity. Over the past decade, it has become more evident that the crisis cannot be resolved through violence, but only through a UN-led political process that would achieve the legitimate rights of the people of Syria and preserves its unity and independence. Today, the Constitutional Committee must be supported to deliver on its intended mandate. There is a need for confidence-building measures, including protection of human rights and urgently addressing the issue of detainees. Humanitarian assistance needed to be provided and delivered unhindered to those who need it. These, among other important elements, have been emphasized in the recent joint ministerial statement by the State of Qatar, the Republic of Turkey, and the Russian Federation, issued on March 11th in Doha. In conclusion, the State of Qatar will continue to work diligently and explore possible ways in cooperation with the international partners to contribute constructively to ending the Syrian crisis. And I thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. I believe Ambassador Feridun Hadi Siniroglu of Turkey has a few comments. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Jouejati. I salute the brave Syrian panelists for their courage. Distinguished panelists and participants, dear colleagues, 10 years ago, on March 15th, the Syrian people stood up peacefully against dictatorship and oppression. In the ensuing decade, millions of Syrians have endured unthinkable agony, misery, and loss under Assad's oppression and machinery of death. They have been gassed, bombarded, besieged, abducted, forcefully disappeared, tortured, sexually abused, recruited as child soldiers, denied food and medicine. Tens of thousands perished in prisons and detention centers. Countless others remain imprisoned. The survivors in Syria endure multifaceted hardships. They live, on one hand, under constant threat of imminent attacks from the regime and terrorist organizations. On the other hand, they struggle to live in a country in ruins without a glimpse of hope for the future. They are freezing and starving. They are traumatized. They have lost their loved ones in the hands of a murderous tyrant. A staggering number of people had to abandon their homes. Over 5.6 million people have fled Syria since 2011. Turkey alone hosts nearly 4 million Syrians, which is almost 1/5 of the entire population of Syria before the start of the conflict. There are 6.2 million people, including 2.5 million children, displaced within Syria, the biggest internally displaced population in the world. To understand the catastrophic consequences of this modern-day exodus on those lucky enough to survive their perilous journey, let us lend an ear to Sajeda. Sajeda was forced from her childhood home as barrel bombs rained down on her city. Her family stuffed a handful of clothes and necessities in a bag, then left. Sajeda says, "When someone asks me, what was the most precious thing you left behind in Syria? I say that I left myself." The conflict had a disproportionate impact on children. It is estimated that 3.7 million Syrian children have been born since 2011. As Syria's war reached its 10th year, it is the only life Syrian children know. Next generation of Syrians face a bleak future, wrought by illiteracy, famine, depression, and PTSD. It is our collective responsibility to bring their suffering to an end. The use of chemical weapons by the Syrian regime has been part of its brutal war against its own people. Assad regime has been found responsible for resorting to chemical weapons on at least 7 occasions. It is a futile effort to deflect blame for its heinous crimes. The regime has fabricated a barrage of letters with false accusations. OPCW Technical Secretariat has recently confirmed that all regime's allegations are unfounded. Countless UN reports have revealed over and over again what we already knew: the acts of the regime amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. It is our collective legal and moral obligation to protect Syrian civilians against the regime's grave atrocities and hold those who are responsible for the crimes against humanity accountable. There will be no lasting peace without accountability and transitional justice. This is the only way to prevent the reoccurrence of such crimes in the future. A genuine political transition and a new Syria can only be built on the sound basis of a closure and the feeling that justice is served. Constitutional Committee's work is critical to achieve this ultimate goal in line with Security Council Resolution 2254. The Commission of Inquiry, OPCW, and the IIIM have been playing a critical role in ensuring that impunity does not take root in post-conflict Syria and that the crimes do not go unpunished. We support and closely cooperate with these bodies towards ensuring accountability for the serious crimes committed by the Syrian regime. Landmark decision of the Koblenz court in Germany sentencing a former intelligence agent of the Syrian regime on charges of aiding and abetting crimes against humanity is an important step in the right direction. However, this is just the tip of the iceberg. The road to justice for atrocities in Syria is long and arduous. Civil society has been playing an important role in revealing the gross human rights violations and raising the legitimate aspirations of people. They constitute the main agents for documenting the most serious crimes committed by the regime. They also play a life-saving role as first responders during regime's brutal attacks. We should address their requests and give more space to their voices so that they can define their own destiny. It is clear that Syria remains first and foremost a serious protection crisis. The responsibility of the international community to protect failed big in Syria. In 2019, we witnessed a relentless military campaign in Idlib under the pretext of combating terrorism, which led to unprecedented levels of displacement along our borders. Today, millions of civilians in Idlib are safe thanks to our resolute actions on the March 5th ceasefire agreement. Having said that, the ongoing humanitarian tragedy in Syria continues to affect millions of innocent Syrians who took refuge in areas along our borders. The regime pursues its massacres through starve and surrender strategy in this all-out war against its own people. In Syria, we are faced with one of the most acute and severe humanitarian crises in the world. Every month, in the Security Council meetings on Syria, I voiced the request by the Syrian people from the international community. The continuation of lifeline UN cross-border humanitarian operations remains at the heart of my messages. Unfortunately, at a critical time, when more humanitarian access is needed due to the pandemic, the Council failed to respond to the basic expectations of Syrian people. In just 1 year's time, cross-border access has been restricted significantly with devastating implications for the population in northern Syria. Although record levels of humanitarian aid is channeled through the single crossing point Bab el-Awa, it is impossible to reach all people in need in the northwest. This is particularly the case for 1.3 million IDPs living in northern Aleppo, who used to receive UN assistance from Bab el-Salam until the obstruction by the regime's backers last July. Shutting down the most direct route to food and medical assistance will not serve the political calculations of those behind it. It is our joint responsibility to reach those in need and coordinate our efforts towards the continuation of UN cross-border operations beyond July 2021. This is indispensable for the transfer of COVID-19 vaccines to millions of people awaiting our help in their fight against the pandemic. This is our duty, and Syrian people deserve our collective action. Syria might have fallen off the front page, but the worst tragedy of the 21st century will not end before the people of Syria have a legitimate government that will come to power through elections in accordance with Resolution 2254, which truly represents their will and enjoys their full consent. We cannot let this conflict rage for 10 more years. Turkey will continue to do its utmost to bring peace and justice to the brave Syrian men and women who have suffered too much for too long. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I believe Ambassador Jeffrey de Laurentiis of the United States has comments. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the Coalition for hosting this event in commemoration of the 10th anniversary when the Syrian people peacefully took to the streets. And thank you, Rafif, for moderating today's panel. The United States is proud to co-sponsor today's event. I would also like to thank all the panelists for their powerful comments and for shining a light on the activism and resilience of Syrians living through the conflict. Your comments today are evidence of a real determination by the Syrian people to engage in a peaceful and democratic political transition, despite all obstacles that would pave way for the resolution of the conflict. It's certainly disheartening that 10 years into the conflict, Syrians endure the unimaginable, the same tragedies, indiscriminate attacks on civilians, arbitrary detention, forced displacement, and an unrelenting humanitarian crisis. We cannot become numb to this suffering. We remain firm in stating that the only way forward is to push for a political process that meets the conditions outlined in Security Council Resolution 2254. We recognize the Syrian Negotiation Commission's efforts to meaningfully participate in the constitutional drafting process. However, our ability to make progress on this front is limited by the Assad regime's continuous refusal to engage in good faith. It's clear that the regime will leverage the upcoming presidential elections in May to unfairly claim Assad's legitimacy. The United States will not recognize these elections unless they are free, fair, representative of Syrian society and supervised by the United Nations. In the absence of serious and meaningful cooperation by the regime and its allies, the United States continues to support the efforts of the Special Envoy on other pressing files, including the release of detainees and the status of missing persons. In the Security Council a few days ago, we called on the Special Envoy to apply greater focus on detainees and to engage directly and more regularly with families of the detained, former detainees themselves, and civil society. And while we press for progress on the political track, we cannot neglect the critical need to provide humanitarian relief to Syrians unable to feed, clothe, or require medical care for themselves and their families. Since 2012, the United States has provided more than $12.2 billion in life-saving assistance to vulnerable Syrians in Syria and the region. But we must do more. We have to do more. In the Security Council, we have continued our campaign to retain and expand the UN's cross-border mechanism. The United States is committed to do what is right to sustain the lifeline for the 3.4 million Syrians in the Northwest and to reinstate the UN's humanitarian access in the Northeast. To conclude, I echo the Secretary General when I say that a credible political settlement cannot wait. I assure you that our steadfast support for the Syrian people will not end. That a decade has passed means we must redouble our efforts to encourage a credible political transition, to hold the regime accountable for its abuses, and to maximize our delivery of humanitarian aid. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I believe Ambassador Günther Sauter of Germany has a few remarks. You have the floor.
Rafif, thank you very much. It feels bad to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the beginning of the Syrian conflict. This is an opportunity for us to think about and to remember how it all started. Even more important, this is an opportunity for us to think about what needs to be done to overcome this nightmare. Let me first of all thank the speakers for your courage and for your clear words. You reminded us of all the things that are important. First of all, you reminded us how it all started with peaceful protests for change and for reform and for the respect of human rights, and with a terribly brutal reply from the regime, which responded by more oppression, violence, torture, and murder. You also reminded us why millions of Syrians fled their country. roughly 1 million of them to my country. Arbitrary detentions, forced disappearance, torture, violence. These are the biggest obstacles to a safe, voluntary and dignified return of refugees and internally displaced persons. And you also reminded us of the systematic and wide-scale violations of international humanitarian law and abuses of international human rights law by the regime and its partners. Let me say we cannot tolerate impunity. This goes in particular for the high-ranking officials in Damascus. But unfortunately, it has not been able to prosecute these people by the International Criminal Court because of the vetoes of Russia and China and the Security Council. There is a small ray of hope. You have taken note of the recent ruling of a court in Germany in the cases of 2 Syrian officials. This is an important first step towards justice and accountability, and I hope it is a ray of light for the tens of thousands who have been victims of torture and have suffered at the hands of the Syrian regime. You have also made it clear that national reconciliation and sustainable peace will only be possible with truth, justice, and accountability, at least for the most serious crimes and atrocities that have been committed during these 10 years. You have stressed that truth, justice, and accountability are also necessary with regard to the tens of thousands who have been arbitrarily detained, who are missing, and who have disappeared. The immediate release of all arbitrarily detained persons is one very important aspect of Security Council Resolution 2254. But you have also made it clear all parts of this resolution must be implemented. And unfortunately, we are very far away from this state. The resolution has not been implemented, and we have frankly not achieved real progress. The primary responsibility lies with the Assad regime, which has been systematically filibustering. What we need now is a political transition in Syria. What we need now is substantial progress in the Constitutional Committee, an end to the persistent and systematic obstruction of the political process by the regime in Damascus. What we need now is free and fair elections pursuant to a new constitution, with all Syrians participating, including those who are now in the diaspora. What we need is a nationwide ceasefire instead of attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure, violating international law and international humanitarian law. And now, last but not least, what we need is unhindered humanitarian access and assistance through all possible routes. This will be a very important discussion here in New York soon, when the renewal of the Security Council Resolution 2533 and the cross-border mechanism will be debated in the Security Council. After 10 years, we finally need to see real progress towards the full implementation of 2255. Let me say very clearly, without this, there can be no financing for reconstruction. Without this, there can be no lifting of sanctions. And without this, all talk about normalization is empty and void. Germany will continue to stand on the side of the Syrian people, and we will support your legitimate aspirations. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And now I believe Ambassador Jonathan Allen from the United Kingdom has a few comments before we move to questions and answers. Ambassador Allen, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. And can I thank the briefers as well for sharing their experiences, their very real and lived experiences. It's something we discuss every month, as others have said, in the Security Council. It's very easy to get into the sort of politics of this debate, and that is important. But it's particularly important to hear from people, explaining their real life experience. So thank you for that. I think there's been a lot said by my colleagues, which I agree with. As we're at the 10-year anniversary of the conflict, I think it's important that we're clear about why it began and what happened. And I think it's really important as well that we resist the efforts that are underway and have been underway throughout the conflict to deny the facts, to distort the record, and to whitewash reality. In the spring of 2011, ordinary Syrians took to the streets of Damascus, Dara, Homs, and other towns and cities across Syria to protest peacefully for greater freedom, better governance, and an end to repression. And Assad and his regime answered those calls with brutal violence, chemical weapons, and starvation. At no point since has the regime seriously engaged in a political process. All it has done is to pursue a ruthless military strategy against its own people to stay in power at any cost. And the Syrian people have suffered a decade of conflict because they dared to stand up and call for an end to oppression, torture, and corruption. Assad and Russia promote the idea that the conflict is over, and they're encouraging normalization in the region. In reality, the regime continues to commit atrocities. It oversees widespread corruption and mismanagement that has wrecked the economy and caused more misery. The false narrative peddled by Assad and Russia is insulting to the Syrian people, and will carry on urging the international community to recognize that the crisis in Syria is ongoing. Now, I know that many Syrians question the international community's role in achieving peace in Syria. The Security Council is obviously divided, and a permanent member, Russia, protects the Assad regime in its violations of the UN Charter, supported by another permanent member, China. But we continue to believe that UNSCR 2254 offers a clear path out of the conflict. We believe in holding the regime accountable for its crimes, and we remain committed to doing all that we can to alleviate the terrible cost of this war on ordinary Syrians. We'll continue to pressure the regime and its backers to engage with the political process outlined in 2254, and that requires a nationwide ceasefire, unhindered aid access, releasing those arbitrarily detained, conditions set for safe refugee return, and free and fair elections, following a new constitution with a clear role for civil society, refugees, women, and minorities. And I want to say that I agree entirely with Nicolas de Rivière, the French ambassador, on the necessary conditions for international funds for reconstruction. As we said in the Security Council this week, although the situation is desperate, the people of Syria have shown incredible resilience. The hope for the future of Syria lies with them, and we'll continue to champion their voices and hear their message. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I believe we can now move into questions and answers, although we have brief comments from Ambassador Stefano Stefanile of Italy. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And let me say first off that I listened very carefully and with great respect and full solidarity to the powerful interventions of today's briefers And I think they reminded us that these 10 long years that have passed since the beginning of the Syrian crisis have been marked by an unimaginable level of suffering and destruction that has contemplated all kinds of crimes, raping and forced disappearances, arbitrary detentions, massive displacements, and gross human rights and humanitarian law violations. And those are all crimes for which the perpetrators must be held accountable and duly prosecuted by making use of all existing instruments and mechanisms. Because the fight against impunity is a matter of principle and justice in the first place, and it must also be an inherent part of any reconciliation process, especially in a Syrian society that has been torn apart by years of conflict. Now, the necessary steps to end the conflict are clear, although their implementation remains indeed a challenge. And those are a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process facilitated by the UN and in line with the criteria set out in UN Resolution 2254. And that implies a nationwide solid ceasefire, free and fair elections open to the diaspora, the release of the detainees and political prisoners, and the safe and dignified return for refugees to their homes. Let me say, as regards specifically the upcoming presidential elections, that they do not comply with the concepts of freedom and fairness, and therefore they cannot be the basis for a re-legitimation of the Syrian regime in any way. Any political and institutional process needs the participation of all Syrians, including the diaspora and the displaced. Now, in order to advance the implementation, the difficult implementation of Resolution 2254, Italy will continue to support the efforts of the UN Special Envoy for Syria, Geir Pedersen, will listen carefully to his latest briefing in the Security Council, and we look forward to clear commitments by all stakeholders to making progress, real progress towards the common goal of peace and stabilization. Italy will continue to give its contribution, standing by the Syrian people and working also with civil society and international organizations to provide relief and life-saving assistance to the most vulnerable. And in this spirit, we look forward to the 5th Brussels conference at the end of this month as a timely opportunity to mobilize further financial support to alleviate the suffering of the Syrian people in Syria and also in the region. At the same time, I also want to say that it is imperative that the regime and its supporters not only engage seriously in the political process, but also allow humanitarian assistance to reach the communities in need. And it is also crucial, as it has already been said by other colleagues, to guarantee unhindered aid access through all possible routes, including through the renewal of Resolution 2533 and the cross-border mechanism by the UN Security Council. So let me say in conclusion, sustainable peace and security in Syria can only be achieved, of course, by a genuine, inclusive and comprehensive Syrian-led political solution. And the Syrian people, especially at this moment, after 10 years of conflict and suffering, need to feel more than ever that the international community is ready to take action to put an end to their plight. And Italy will certainly continue to stand by their side. I thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I believe we have an intervention from Ambassador Mia Raini from Finland. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for this important event today. We are indeed commemorating a very grim anniversary this week, and the devastating conflict in Syria has continued for 10 years now, and no clear end to hostilities is in sight. We have repeatedly witnessed horrific scenes from Syria, and the grave violations of human rights and international humanitarian law are so appalling and unacceptable. We must also end impunity for the most serious international crimes, and those who have become victims of such crimes need our solidarity. It has been a great disappointment that efforts to refer the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court have been vetoed in the Security Council. Finland has been a core supporter of the international, impartial and independent mechanism for the crimes committed in Syria since the foundation of the mechanism. The work of the IIIM in bridging the gap between recent crimes and uncertain future prosecutions is crucial. We also welcome the ongoing trials under the principle of universal jurisdiction that can give Syrians sound justice and accountability. The dire humanitarian situation in Syria calls for urgent and unimpeded flow of humanitarian aid, as many colleagues have today highlighted. We support the efforts of Special Envoy Geir Pedersen in advancing a political solution in line with the Security Council Resolution 2254 and regret the stalemate of the Constitutional Committee caused by the Syrian regime. Releasing detainees would be a way to show goodwill and build confidence, which is currently so low. Finland supports Syria with peace-building efforts, improving resilience in Syrian communities and of the neighboring countries, and with humanitarian aid. Finally, I would have liked to ask about civil society participation in the political process, but I believe we do not have a lot of time left for replies now, so I only want to warmly thank Ms. Walaa Ahmado and Ms. Thuraya for their interventions today, and stress the importance of hearing voices of civil society also in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. That is actually a good segue to one of the first questions that we received. What measures can be taken to support and empower displaced women in Syria? And if Ms. Hejazi's audio is working fine, I would love for her to give us a very quick answer. We are running out of time.
شكرا. بداية المفروض لما نحن بنحكي عن تمكين النساء، وإذا نحن بدنا نعتبرهم فعلا هن كانوا عم يحملوا العبء الأكبر من الحرب، فبالبداية المفروض يكون عندهم وصول للخدمات الأساسية اللي هن بحاجة لها، وخاصة بالنسبة للصحة. بالإضافة أنه صحيح بيصير في عمليات تمكين سياسي وتمكين نفسي كتير واسع، بس النساء السوريات بحاجة تمكين اقتصادي، لأنه نحن بنقول أنه النساء السوريات إذا ما بيقدروا يحصلوا على تمكين اقتصادي ودعم على هيدا الصعيد، ما ممكن يكون في تخصيص وقت لحتى يكونوا هن فعلا فاعلات بالشأن العام. ممكن يكون في عنا أدوات كتيرة، ممكن يكون في صناديق مخصصة لدعم النساء تحديداً، ممكن المساعدات الإنسانية اللي بتم دخولها تراعي موضوع الجندر. اليوم نحن بسبب جائحة كورونا موضوع التفاعل عن بعد صار يعني أمر واقع، وصرنا نحن بنشوف إيجابياته حتى، فنحن بنقدر نعمل كتير استثمار لعمليات حتى التعليم عن بعد، تمكين القدرات عن بعد. آخر شيء وأهم شيء نحن بنشوف إنه النساء السوريات هن بحاجة بناء قدرات غير تقليدي خارج المهن التقليدية اللي هن بيشتغلوا فيها أو اللي المجتمع فرضها عليهم. وفي أمثلة كتير من النساء السوريات كانوا مبدعات بمجالات كتير كان هي يعني مجالات كتير عصرية. فبتخيل إنه هدول 3 نقاط يعني أهم ما ممكن نبلش بالشغل فيهم. شكراً لك.
Thank you very much. Before we move on to any other questions, we have Mr. Andrea Pontiroli from the delegation of the European Union. Sir, the floor is yours, but we have very little time.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to all the briefer for the words. As others recalled before me, 10 years ago, peaceful protests began throughout Syria, but the regime brutal repression of these peaceful protests and of the Syrian people and its failure to address the root causes of the uprising resulted in an escalated international armed conflict. Abuses, human rights violation, and grave violation of international humanitarian law by all parties, particularly by the Syrian regime, have caused enormous human suffering. Accountability is essential, both as a legal requirement, but also to ensure sustainable peace and genuine reconciliation. Allow me just to touch briefly on the Syrian refugee crisis. As you know, this is the largest displacement crisis in the world, and the European Union believes that conditions are not in place for the safe, voluntary, dignified, and sustainable return of refugees. The conflict in Syria, as many have said already, is far from over. The European Union demands an end to repression, the release of detainees, and that the Syrian regime and its allies engage meaningfully in the full implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 2254. And also allow me to recall that without credible progress, and as long as the repression continues, targeted EU sanctions on leading members and entities of the regime will be renewed, and the end of May. Let me briefly touch on the fact that on 29 and 30 March, as other speakers mentioned, we will co-chair with the UN the 5th Brussels Conference on supporting the future of Syria and of the region. And we call on all international actors with influence in the Syrian crisis to come together to support a political solution in accordance with Security Council Resolution 2254 and to support the efforts by Special Envoy Pedersen. And at the conference, there will also be a strong call to ensure unhindered humanitarian access and to renew and broaden the Security Council authorization for cross-border humanitarian assistance in July. And as in previous years, the conference will also generate international financial support. To conclude, Madam Chair, I would like to reiterate the European Union full political and humanitarian support to the Syrian people in the pursuit of a peaceful and sustainable future. Thank you very much.
Sir, I believe we have essentially run out of time, so I would like to just make some closing remarks. Clearly, Syria is top of mind for all of us here. I would like to once again thank our co-sponsors, esteemed speakers, and those who participated with such thought-provoking commentary. In concluding the event, I would like to leave you with a few thoughts. After 10 years of conflict, it is time to bring freedom, democracy, peace, and security to Syria. Our numbers are staggering, paralyzing, but we cannot be limited or seen as mere statistics. I'd like to put it in perspective. Imagine if the entire population of Tallinn were killed in airstrikes or gas attacks. Imagine if the combined populations of Berlin, Paris, London, Doha, Ankara, and Washington, D.C. were food insecure. What would that look like from a humanitarian perspective, from a political perspective, or a logistical one? It is obviously time for the international community to take meaningful action. We thank you again for your time and your comments and your continued support of the Syrian people. Let us hope that we will not be back here in another 10 years. Thank you very much, and I wish you a pleasant day. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.